All right. So today's lesson is looking at the theories of evolution. And evolution, as we've indicated before, is just how living things have changed over time. And there were several influential individuals that have aided in this information, the collection of information, and quite frankly, some fossils that help stimulate the conversation. So, what I like to do is start with that, and that is looking at some of the mysteries that have baffled early scientists. For example, if you look at these fossils, some of the older sediments that seem to contain some very simple organisms, like you might find in the oceans, um, it- or, that contain these simple organisms than more recent layers, and that these older layers of sediment included animals that do not exist today. And animals that exist today were not found in these oldest layers. So if we look at some of those influential individuals, Lamarck was one of those. He looked at some of those patterns of the fossilization, and he had some questions, and he came up with what he thought at the time was some solutions. So he lived in the 1700s, and he suggested that living species had descended from extinct species. So, for example, if we look at the ducks here, you tried to, if you were Lamarck, you would look at organisms that may have some similar features, and how that was maybe passed from one generation to the next. He developed this idea at the time called acquired traits. And acquired traits are those that arrive or arise during the organism's lifetime and can be passed on to the offspring. So, for example, those web feet on the on the duck here, the waterfowl, the organism stretch is a result of the organism stretching, and over time, as that organism continued to stretch between those fingers or his phalanges, then the webbing began to occur as a result because it was an advantage between the toes, and so that's how Lamarck would explain that. Much similar, like if I were to say that I have a tattoo on my shoulder here, and I have a tattoo that says "I love biology." Um, what Lamarck would suggest then is that the offspring that were born would, from me and my wife, would also have a tattoo that says "I love biology." Well, we know that that's not true, but that's the same idea and the same philosophy that Lamarck was suggesting at the time. It was wrong, but it was a start. And he was looking at the fossils and how things are being transferred from one organism that's older to the newer generation. Same thing with mice and their tails. Um, but again, these were disproven again, time and time again. And so, really, what we look at today as a reemphasis is acquired traits are not genetic. In other words, we know that the only way that you can pass something on to the next generation is through your DNA, specifically through your sperm and the egg. That's the only way that you can pass those traits on to the next generation. But that's something we know nowadays. In Lamarck's time and in Darwin's time, Charles Darwin, who lived in the 1800s, again, didn't know anything about DNA. And so, what we look at, for example, an individual like Charles Darwin, he was very influential because of some of the things that he observed and recorded at that time. Um, in 1831, for example, he traveled on a boat called the HMS Beagle. And for 5 years, he was considered the ship's naturalist, meaning that he started up here in England, and with his shipmates, they traveled down along the coast of South America, traveled up into the western part of South America, and they would board or actually disembark from the ship onto the land, the islands, whatever they came across. They were looking for things, particularly, some type of gold or some type of fortunes that they could trade or look to the indigenous cultures. But what the point was is that he had an extensive travel record. Went into an area that I'll point to again, which is called the Galapagos Islands, just to the west of South America. He continued on into New Zealand and Australia and the Indian Oceans and Africa, and then back up to Europe. That took 5 years. And I would say that Darwin was much like, if you know of somebody that is a hoarder, where they would go. In this case, Darwin would go to the land with his shipmates, and he would collect things, whether it's animals, plants, rocks, anything that was of interest to him, and he would bring it back on his ship, and he'd put it down below, and he kept on going to the next destination, and he would just continue to collect. Again, he was a naturalist and a modern day hoarder. Well, this continued on, but some of the most dramatic areas that he visited, he didn't know it at the time, was in an area, as I pointed out, which was the Galapagos Islands. And on those islands, he came across some very unique species that he and others had never seen before. Some turtles and some iguanas and some plant species and bird species that, again, were unique to that island. Much like the kangaroos would be a unique species to Australia. You can't find in any other areas in the world except for Australia. So that's what Darwin was, I guess, observing, recording, and collecting during his trips on the HMS Beagle. And again, remember, this was in the early 1800s. So that travel was slow. Again, they came across all those inconveniences and no, had really very little conveniences living on a ship for those 5 years. But in the end, when he got back to England, he became convinced that organisms changed over time. And eventually, he wrote a book called The Origin of Species. Now, again, he scratched his head. He made those observations from all of his collections that were on board the HMS Beagle. He removed them all, and again, he just mulled through and made some observations that, again, that were eventually recorded and written as the origin of this book called The Origin of Species. Now, it's significant to note that it contradicted, or areas of his book and observations contradicted some of the teachings of the day. And so he wasn't necessarily welcomed by everybody because of some of his thoughts and some of his writings. But again, the idea is that things change over time. They weren't stagnant, they weren't permanent, as what the church was suggesting at the time. And so this was Charles Darwin in the 1800s. I will make a special note that much of what Charles Darwin wrote about, we still present today as part of the theory of evolution. And that's a collection of this mounds of evidence that, yes, as Charles would suggest, things do change over time. And it's up to us now to determine why and how. And as we'll look at, DNA provides some of the best evidence for that. So Darwin's big idea was this. There was this descent, what he called descent with modification. So if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see that you have an early ancestor. And what Darwin would suggest is that these newer forms that are found on the upper layers of the earth, if they're fossils, or even those that were present today, were descendants from earlier species that we may or may not have found or had seen in the 1800s. In other words, these fossils in the fossil record. And so that they're all somehow related to each other. Sometimes they were very distant relatives. And in the case of the finches, sometimes they were fairly recent relationships that were closely related to each other. But what Darwin suggested is that even the finch was related to the armadillo. Again, it's just got an ancient history to that. So that this big idea was that all species descended from the original ancestor. Now, remember, I said that Darwin wasn't welcomed throughout the scientific and religious community because he even included humans, which was a radical idea at the time. In other words, he said all living things are related. Anything that is living and that was living is somehow related to each other. And so that was the big idea at the time. And our job now is to try to refute that idea as scientists. All right. Second part to that was natural selection. In other words, natural selection is the two words that we use to describe how evolution happens. And one of the things that Darwin noted, this is all from Darwin's information, was that Darwin noted that there was an overproduction of offspring. So more offspring are produced than can survive. If you live in Minnesota, we know this. I mean, the thousands of mosquitoes that are hatched when there's enough rain and heat to exist in the summertime is very, very evident. But even these ducks here, you'll notice that the duck getting over the curve here, very few of these are going to reach reproductive age. Almost all of these, it looks like there's 7 or 8 ducklings, are going to be food or won't survive because of lack of space or a variety of environmental conditions or predators. So we know that this overproduction does occur. And that was one of the observations of this idea of natural selection. So offspring are competing for some of these limited resources, even amongst brothers and sisters or siblings and with each other. And the environment is constantly changing. We know this. We live in an age where it can be 30 degrees one day and 100 degrees the next, it seems like. And so these food resources, predators, and climates all influence disease, all influence the survival of an individual. The second part was that of what Darwin would suggest as natural selection and how evolution happens is genetic variations. Now, this is something that's been we kind of add on to, especially with our information on DNA. But genetic variations means this: that they have slightly different DNA, and some of these differences, these variations, we would refer to it as adaptations. In other words, it makes an organism better fit to survive. And if they're better fit to survive, that means that they can um, pass their successful genes, or what we would call DNA, on to the next generation. Um, a third item of natural selection that we oftentimes focus on is that the struggle for survival. In other words, what oftentimes people misinterpret as natural selection is the survival of the fittest. These individuals that are competing for resources allow for some of these unique traits that organisms possess. You could ask the question, well, why is the cheetah so fast? Why is the gazelle even faster? There seems to be these ideas of these coevolutionary evolutionary traits that are passed from one generation to the next, and sometimes they influence even some of the surrounding species that they're, in a sense, evolving with. A fourth item there is differential reproduction. In other words, those with the best adaptations, the best traits, are more likely to survive and reproduce. And it's not necessarily the strongest individual, it's not necessarily the largest or the most colorful. But if there's a trait that benefits the organism, you could be Superman, for example, and you could have the best traits in the world. But if you walk across the street and get hit by a bus, you're not going to pass those superior traits on to the next generation. So you have to survive. And the other part of that is if these traits like leaping over tall buildings or some other traits, I'm exaggerating obviously, allow you to reproduce or get to reproductive age, that's going to be an advantage for the species because you obviously all possess some of these traits. That's why you're here today, is that we're continually passing on these successful traits to the next generation. So that these offspring that are being produced by us and others, plants and lions and tigers and bears, are similar, but sometimes there are some small little variations that exist because of that. So over time, what we're suggesting is that these variations add up, and they add up to make that individual even more successful. Again, evolution doesn't occur in one generation. Evolution is this long string of generations from one to another, your grandfather and mother, to your parents, to yourself, to your offspring, to your, again, it's evolution exists in many generations. It doesn't occur in just one generation. So eventually these differences are so great that even new species can be recognized. As I said, Darwin went to an area in the Galapagos Island and he noticed a variety of bird species that were all finches, but they all had unique bird beaks and specialities that allowed them to feed on different food sources. And so there was a fairly recent evolutionary change that was occurring within that species of birds that he had discovered and brought back with him to England, that he was able to analyze and suggest that there's this relationship. Um, if within the notes there you want to click on some of the, how does evolution occur and how does it really work, I have a special PBS link that does a pretty good job of that. So what causes some of these useful variations? Well, what Darwin knew back then to what we know now has dramatically changed. But he suggested these. We know what these useful variations are. They're mutations, and a vast majority of these genetic mutations are either harmful or don't affect the organism at all. So if you look at, for example, the hands there from left to right, you'll notice that some of these are just different variations. And maybe potentially this would be an advantage to have 5 fingers, but 3 of them linked together in a particular pattern or feature, depending upon the organism. But these are all human hands. And one would suggest that these mutations may or may not be beneficial. So, not all mutations are necessarily bad, they're not good, they're just what they are. It's the environment and where that organism is placed. It could be a benefit or it may not be. But it's up to us to successfully pass that on to the next generation. And that's what we're building on. The theory of evolution is to build on the idea that an extremely rare occasion, if a mutation can offer some survival or reproductive advantage to the organism, therefore maybe it's healthier or better able to reproduce. That's what we're looking for. So, kind of in summary here, if there are variations in a trait, some beetles, for example, in the diagram might be green, they might be brown, but if that green variation is a detriment, where they're selected against with their predators, maybe it's a type of bird species that feeds on a particular beetle, then that's not necessarily an advantage. So there is this differential reproduction as a result of that. So we're passing successful brown traits that kind of blend in and camouflage that beetle to the next generation. And eventually, you'll see more and more of those brown beetles as a result of this technique, or actually this variation that's being popped up through the DNA. Environment can't support unlimited population growth, however. So not all of individuals are going to, again, reach reproductive age to their full potential. And therefore, what we're going to have is a population based upon those that survive. So this is what we refer to as heredity, the heredity of passing your successful genes on to the next generation. And those surviving brown beetles can produce more of those brown baby beetles because of this trait. Now, if some of those green ones continue to survive and all of a sudden conditions change where a green background is more beneficial, you can imagine what's going to happen in that eventually some of the green beetles will repopulate the population. So the end result is that the more advantageous the trait, in this case the brown coloration, allows the organisms to have more offspring, become more common in the population. And then again, if it continues, nearly all the individuals in the population will be brown unless the environmental conditions change. So again, we mentioned the question down below where it says, what would happen if the environment changed later and the tree trunks became more moss covered or green? You can imagine that. So the secret to evolution is what we will mention here, and that is some selective pressures. A species doesn't evolve unless there is a selective pressure. And a selective pressure means that there are new genes, in this case, that will come and go without changing the species overall as a group or as a whole. But you start introducing a new predator, a new food source, climate change, and diseases. Those are pressures, and those may change the adaptability and the ability for those organisms to survive. That's what we're looking at here, the selective pressures. Um, if there are no successful individuals, no successful genes already present, the species may go extinct. So you think about those organisms that are no longer present today, those large brontosauruses that used to roam the earth. the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Obviously, they were very successful in their day, but why aren't they here now? Obviously, something that was influencing environmentally the success of those organisms, like those large dinosaurs. We know that the molecular color of these mutations, whether they're in pocket mice, whether they're brown or black, can also demonstrate that current day. And so, one of the things that we do in class is that I like to show a video that demonstrates these little pocket mice down in the desert Southwest, and how if we go to the lava fields or we go to the desert, depending on their coloration, we can see some of these mutations benefit the organism.